Okay, well, we're diving in now. We're going to be looking this morning at the third family of arguments for the existence of God. If you remember, my apologetic method begins with reasons to believe that there is a God in the first place. So we're looking at arguments to believe that God does, in fact, exist. In a couple of weeks, we're going to switch gears and start having, a conversation among theists. Because even among those of us who believe that there's a God, there's different conceptions about what that God is like. So obviously Christians have certain beliefs about what God is like. Other theists, like maybe Aristotle or Muslims, would have a different idea about what this God is like. So that's when we're going to shift gears and talk about whose conception of God is correct. But at this point, we're still talking just about the existence of God. How do we even know that there is a God, a supreme being? Well, this morning I'm excited because we're going to be looking at the area of apologetics that I've specialized in over the last 10 to 15 years. The other arguments for God's existence were more science-based, and that's not my professional training. I don't have a background in the sciences. So this area, the moral argument for God, is where I've specialized. I'm going to give you just a quick summary of the argument. Here it is in a nutshell, very simple. I'm giving you a very simplified version of it, just so you can get your mind around it, and then we'll go through the details more in depth. But it starts out, similar to the other ones, it starts out with a particular phenomenon that we've discovered. And that phenomenon, in this case, is moral truth. It seems as though in this reality we find ourselves in, that there are certain moral truths, such as murder is wrong, torturing somebody for fun is immoral. Humans have moral value. We can't treat humans the way we treat, let's say, farm animals, right? Humans have certain moral rights. So there's all these aspects of morality, moral truth, that we seem to have discovered in this reality we exist in. So the question becomes, well, where do these moral truths come from? And according to this argument, God is the best explanation for these moral truths. And so that's how the argument flows. If God is the best explanation for these things, then we have a good reason to believe that God does in fact exist. So instead of scientists being the source material for this particular argument, this is going to be more in the area of philosophy. So here's a professional philosopher. I guess you could say he's a contemporary proponent of this argument. So this argument, this issue of morality, where it comes from, is God the best explanation? Just like the scientific arguments we've looked at, these conversations are taking place at the highest academic level, okay? I know we're just at a local church and Sunday school this morning, but this argument, the moral argument, people are discussing it, writing very in-depth academic material on it at the highest level. So I want you to be aware of that. Robert Adams is probably the most well-known proponent of this argument right now, and he's been a philosophy professor at Oxford, Yale, I believe UCLA as well. So just somebody you should be familiar with. His main book on this particular subject is called Finite and Infinite Goods. Well, let's walk through the argument now. We'll start with premise one. There are objective moral truths. Now you might recognize right away that this is a little bit different than the other two arguments, the first cause and the design argument. Because it doesn't start with scientific evidence, it begins with something else. It begins with morality, which isn't a scientific thing, right? We can't do science experiments on love or justice. We can't look at kindness or fairness under a microscope. So some people, for that reason, aren't as much they don't like this argument as much as the others. Because we live in a very scientific culture, and people are drawn to the first cause and the design arguments for that reason, because it begins with scientific discoveries. Whereas this begins with something that's not scientific, it has to do with ethics and morality. Now, some don't like the argument as much for that reason, but other people actually like this argument more for that reason, because it begins with something that is self-evident. So in a sense, you could say it begins with something that's even stronger than scientific evidence. It begins with something that is self-evident. What does it mean to be self-evident? Well, if something is self-evident, it doesn't need to be proven with evidence because we intuitively know it's true. We're pretty familiar with the idea of something being self-evident in this country, right? Because our country, the United States of America, was built on the idea that some things are just self-evident. We intuitively, once we understand the structure of the sentence and the meaning of the words, we know that it's true. It's self-evidently true. We don't need any evidence to prove it's true. We just intuitively know it's true. So, for example, our Declaration of Independence starts out saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't need to give any evidence for these things. They're self-evident themselves. That all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, so on and so forth. And so many people have argued that moral truth is like that. Moral truth is self-evident. We just intuitively know that some things are objectively right, other things are objectively wrong. Let's pause here for just a minute and talk about that key word here in the argument, the word objective. What does that mean? That's kind of a big word. What does the term objective mean? Well, sometimes when we want to understand what a word means, we can look at the opposite of it. So as you can imagine, the opposite of objective is something that is subjective. So let's talk about actually subjective beliefs for just a moment. Because some people would say that these moral truths, these moral statements that we're making, murder is wrong, torturing somebody for fun is wrong, some people say that those are subjective beliefs. What do they mean by that when they say they're subjective? Well, those who argue that morality is subjective say that morality is kind of like your favorite flavor of ice cream, right? We all understand that our favorite flavor of ice cream is subjective because it depends only on how you think. That's what it means to be subjective. So let's say tomorrow your favorite flavor of ice cream changes, right? If you change your mind about your favorite flavor, well, then your favorite flavor changes because it's only based on how you think. There's no objectively right or wrong answer to that, what is your favorite flavor of ice cream? It depends on your subjective preferences. It's subjective and thus it's relative per person. So my favorite is chocolate, yours might be vanilla. It's relative, it's subjective. So that's what a subjective belief, that's how a subjective belief works. And some people claim that moral beliefs work that way, that they're just subjective, they're just different preferences. And so we need to argue that there's more to morality than just our subjective beliefs. We need to make a case, and that's what premise 1 is all about, we need to make a case that there are objective moral truths that are fixed independently of how we think. So in a sense, think of like mathematical truths. Those would be the classic example of objective truths that are fixed independent from how we think of them. So if moral truth is objective, then it's similar to mathematical truth in that it can't be changed even if our beliefs about them change. Similarly, if moral truths are objective, like mathematical truths, then we don't create them, we actually discover them. So that's the language you might have noticed that I've been using already this morning, is that we discover moral truth. We don't create it or construct it, we actually discover it, just like we discover mathematical truths. They exist somehow, we haven't gotten there yet, but we need to argue that these moral truths exist somehow out there, apart from us, independent from how we think. So here's a really good thought experiment. This is used quite often in various areas of philosophy, but it's most helpful, I think, here in this context. This is a really good thought experiment if you're wondering if something is subjective or it's objective. So here's the thought experiment. Imagine a mad scientist. By the way, does anybody recognize who that mad scientist is? All right, my generation will recognize that back in the 80s. Good old Christopher Lloyd. So just imagine a mad scientist out there who, I don't know, put something in our drinking water or slipped something in our coffee this morning, gave us all pills. Somehow a mad scientist got us all, let's say pills, gave us all pills so that we all think something wacky is true, like gross pistachio ice cream is our favorite, right? Let's say he gave us pills so that we all think pistachio ice cream is our favorite. Well, if he did that, would that make pistachio ice cream our favorite? Yes, it would. Because our favorite flavor of ice cream is dependent on how we think, right? And if we think our favorite is pistachio, then our favorite is pistachio. It's subjective in that sense. Let's do another thought experiment. Let's say a mad scientist gave us all pills so that tomorrow morning we woke up thinking 2 + 2 = 5. Now, if we all thought that, everybody in the world thought that tomorrow, would that make 2 + 2 = 5? No, it wouldn't, because that is an objective truth that is fixed independently of how we think about it. So even if we all thought 2 + 2 = 5, it wouldn't be the case. You see the difference? So the key question becomes, what about morality? What about morality? For example, if a mad scientist gave us all pills so that tomorrow we woke up thinking that murder was morally okay, everybody in the world thought that tomorrow, would that make murder morally okay? I think we can argue, and this is part of that self-evident intuition that we have, I think we would recognize that no, murder would still be evil tomorrow, even if none of us thought it was. So that can be a helpful thought experiment to point out to somebody that there are objective moral truths that are fixed independent of how we think about them. Here's a Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, probably one of the most well-known Christian philosophers over the last 50 years, has done a remarkable job arguing for Christianity in the university context, professional philosophical context. Alvin Plantinga is his name. He described objective moral truths like this. He said, moral truths are objective in the sense that they're in a certain way independent of human beliefs and desires. It's wrong to torture people for the fun of it, and it would remain wrong if most or all of the world's population came to believe that this behavior is perfectly acceptable. Now, there are people who will argue against this first premise, right? There are people who still maintain that no, morality is subjective. It's all based on what you think. It's based on what you believe. It's subjective. And so I'm going to throw up some of these arguments, summary of some of these arguments, and I want to give you guys just a few minutes with each other to talk about them. How would you respond if you were in a conversation with somebody, a friendly, respectful conversation with someone who believes that morality is subjective, right? It's kind of like your favorite flavor of ice cream, and they gave you some of these reasons to think that, how would you lovingly push back? How would you lovingly push back against their argument, these arguments that morality is subjective? take a look at these, and I'll give you just a few minutes to discuss with your neighbor there. Okay, let's go through these real quick. I overheard some of your conversations and I think you guys are on the right track. But let's just go through these real quick and walk through how we would respond if people would make these arguments with us. So we'll eliminate some confusion, right? Some of these can be a bit tricky. So let's think about the first one here. People disagree about moral issues, therefore morality is subjective. Well, it is true, right, that people disagree about all sorts of things, right? Abortion, euthanasia, those are some of the hot topics in ethics and moral issues. But there's all sorts of things. I mean, probably within your own family there's disagreements sometimes about what is right and wrong. So does this mean that morality is subjective since people disagree? Well, no, actually this is a good point for morality being objective, right? Because if we're disagreeing about it, what does that assume? If we're disagreeing about it, we're assuming there's a right answer. We wouldn't be arguing about it if we thought it was just our personal preferences, right? I mean, nobody argues about what the right flavor of ice cream is. I mean, sometimes maybe we do just out of fun, right? But nobody takes those arguments seriously. But moral arguments, we take those seriously, right? Because we're assuming there's an objectively right answer. And we're arguing for what we think is correct. So actually, the fact that there's disagreement goes to show that we believe there is objective moral truth. Otherwise, we wouldn't have disagreements. All right, just because there's some disagreement over some things doesn't prove that all morality is subjective. So let's look at the second one. Sometimes we don't know what the right thing to do is. And so people will use that to make the case that morality is subjective. If you go to a college ethics class, the classic example will be that situation where there's too many people in the boat and there's only enough resources for one less person. And so you got to choose who's going to be thrown overboard to the sharks, right? And so oftentimes the moral of the story, because everybody comes up with a different answer, right? The moral of the story is, it's just all subjective. Morality is all subjective because we choose to throw off different people from the boat. They're using, in a situation like that, they're using a very difficult example to try to make the case that morality is subjective. But look, our claim here is not that we always know what the right answer is. That's not what we're claiming. When we claim that there is objective moral truth, all we're saying is that there are objective right answers. We're not saying that we always know what they are. Sometimes it can be very difficult for us to know what is the right thing to do. We're not claiming it's easy, we're just claiming that there is a right answer. It's similar to science or mathematics, other fields of objective truth. Just because something's difficult to know within math or something's difficult within science to figure out, that doesn't mean that there's not a right answer. We just don't give up and go home. No, we keep working at it to try to figure out what the right answer is. So I think we can lovingly say, no, just because there's some difficult situations to figure out, that doesn't prove that all morality is subjective. All right, the next one had to do with cultures. If you remember, different people groups, different societies, different cultures, different countries have different moral norms. So one of the classic examples is in America, we teach our children that when they meet someone, they should what? Look them in the eye and shake their hand vigorously, right? But in a lot of Oriental countries, they're taught to do just the opposite. Do not look the person in the eye and definitely don't touch them, right? They're supposed to bow, and that's how to greet someone. And so folks will use situations like that to try to make the case that morality is subjective. It's right to do this in America and right to do it differently, let's say, in Japan. Therefore, morality is subjective. The way that we can respond to this is just to say, look, we're not claiming that all of the traditions and moral norms that we practice are objectively true. We're just saying that some are objectively true. Certainly there's all sorts of customs and moral norms that we have constructed, right? We have different cultural differences, right? But take something that's more clear-cut, like torturing somebody for fun or murder. That's going to be wrong no matter what culture you're in, right? And if a culture believes that those things are okay, let's say Nazi Germany, we would just say that that culture is incorrect, okay? So it's not relative per culture. In fact, if you go back to that greeting example, they actually both point to some sort of objective moral truth that human beings have value and that we should respect them and give them honor when we greet them. We might have developed different greeting customs, but both in, let's say, Japan and America, we should honor a person when we meet them and acknowledge their existence as a human being. And so they're actually, even though there's different greetings, they're both pointing to the fact that there is objective moral worth that human beings have. So you can turn that around and actually make a case for objective moral truth through that example. And then the last one had to do with changes, right? So some people would say, look, morality is subjective because it changes throughout time. Generations have different moral beliefs. For example, in our own country, we used to think that slavery was okay, and now we don't. So, see, morality changes. It's just subjective. But, as I think I already pointed out, the way that we would respond to that is to say, no, morality isn't changing. Our beliefs about what is right and wrong change, and hopefully get better over time, right? So when we used to think that slavery was okay, those folks were incorrect. They were wrong to believe that. Just as though they would, if they were believing 2 + 2 = 5, they were wrong. But now, we've learned, just like with science or mathematical truth, we've learned, and so beliefs do change, but the objective moral truth doesn't change. Okay, we can also give positive reasons that we should believe that morality is objective. One of the most powerful ways to do this is called reductio ad absurdum. That's just a fancy Latin term to point out that if your opponent's position is true, it leads to very weird, strange absurdities that are self-evidently wrong, okay? So we can point out the absurdities of believing that morality is subjective. I'll give you some examples here. So if morality was subjective, if it was just like our favorite flavor of ice cream, we wouldn't be able to say who is good and who is evil. That seems a bit absurd. Sure, we'd have opinions, we'd have different thoughts about who is good and who is evil, but that's all they would be, is just opinions. It would be just your opinion versus my opinion, which seems, again, a bit absurd. So in order to be able to say who is a good person and who is an evil person, there must be some sort of objective standard that exists beyond our opinions, such that we can judge whether our opinions are correct, so that we can judge who is good and who is evil. Another way to point out that our opponent's position is absurd is to say that, look, if morality was subjective, we wouldn't be able to condemn any of these things. One of the most hot-button topics right now is to condemn racism and oppression, which, if defined correctly, both of those things are evil. I agree. But if you're going to maintain that morality is subjective, it's very difficult for you to maintain those things are evil without just saying they're your opinion. And so see how absurd it would be to hold that all morality is subjective? If that was the case, you wouldn't be able to condemn any of these things. You could say you don't like these things, but that's about it. So it's very, very difficult for somebody to hold that morality is subjective. It's very difficult for somebody to be consistent in that position. Yeah, when you're sitting in a college class and theoretically talking about morality, it's easy to think it's subjective, right? But once you get out in the world and you actually start experiencing things, it's very hard to hold that position consistently, especially when somebody wrongs you, okay? So when you are wronged, that's when our self-evident intuition flames up, right? When somebody harms us, when somebody's wrong against us, we don't say, well, it's my opinion that was wrong. No, we scream out for justice. And so it's easy to hold this theoretical idea that morality is all subjective until you go out into the real world and somebody harms you or does something wrong against you. Then it's hard to hold that consistently. So when you're harmed or when you're wronged against, that's when our intuition, it becomes most self-evident that morality is objectively true. So let's move on to premise 2 now. I think we've made a decent case in the time that we're allotted here that morality is objective. The question becomes, how is it that morality can exist out there somehow independent from us? Most people actually agree that morality is objective. Okay, once you get down to brass tacks and have the conversation long enough, most people will agree that there are at least some moral truths that are objectively fixed, independent of how we think. The more interesting question, I think, is premise 2, and that is, how can this be? How can there be these moral truths that exist out there independent from us? Where do they come from? What is the source or foundation for these moral truths? What's the best explanation for them? And that takes us into the work of premise 2. And this is the area that I specialize in and have probably spent the last 10 to 12 years studying and focusing, writing, researching just on this issue. So you're seeing how much there is to apologetics in this entire semester-long class. And here I specialize in one premise, in one argument, right? That's how nitty-gritty some of these things become. But I've really enjoyed my work in this area, and I'm excited to share it with you guys. I make the case that God is the best explanation for how and why there are objective moral truths. Before we get into that, though, let's clarify what we're not saying, okay? Because at this point, I found a lot of atheists get confused, and they don't understand what we're saying. They think that we're accusing them of being bad people. They think that we're accusing or that we're saying they can't be good because they don't believe in God. But that's not what we're saying at all, at least in this argument. So let's clarify here. We're not saying that atheists can't be morally good, okay? That's not the argument we're making. I want to be very clear about this. Yes, I understand that nobody's perfect. None of us are perfect. Christians, theists, atheists, none of us are perfect. We all make moral mistakes. The point that we're making here is not that somehow Christians or theists are morally better than atheists, right? We all make moral mistakes. That's not the issue whatsoever. Atheists can be moral. They can live generally morally good lives. We're not claiming that all atheists go around and, eat kittens for breakfast. That's not the argument. We're also not arguing that atheists can't know morality because they don't believe in God. That's not the case either. Atheists certainly can know moral truth without believing in God. Now, the way that we would understand how this works as Christians is based on Romans 2, that God has written on our hearts, every human being's hearts, moral truth. And so that's how we would understand atheists do, in fact, know moral right from wrong in general, like all of us do, because of Romans 2. So they don't need to believe in God to know what's right from wrong. We're not making the case that atheists can't know morality. They do, in fact, know moral truth. So our argument here is that, look, atheists don't have a good, plausible, reasonable explanation for how these objective truths exist. They don't have a good, reasonable, plausible explanation for how there can be these moral truths that exist independently from us, independent from our thinking, independent from our minds. They don't have a good explanation for that. We're making the case that our explanation for how there can be objective moral truths is better. And our explanation entails that there is a God. Now, sometimes people will get a little bit more complicated here, and they'll say, look, if morality is self-evident, then it doesn't need an explanation, right? Didn't you say at the very beginning of your slides that morality is self-evident? Something that's self-evident doesn't need an explanation. Well, this is a little bit technical, but we have to think through it. When they make that argument, and this is very common even in philosophy, when they make this argument, they're confusing what it means to know something and what it means for something to exist. Okay? They're confusing knowing and existing. So let me just make the distinction here. If something's self-evident, it means that it doesn't need an explanation for how we know it. We know it self-evidently. So if something is self-evident, we don't need an explanation for how we know it. But being self-evident is different than being self-existent. Okay? If something is self-existent, then it doesn't need an explanation for how it exists. It just exists on its own. And we're not saying that morality is self-existent. Okay? We're saying it's self-evident. So we don't need an explanation for how we know it, but we do need an explanation for how it can exist, because we're not saying it is self-existent. If there is moral truth, then it needs an explanation for how it can exist, where it came from, what caused it. It can't have come from us because, again, that would be subjective. Now, it doesn't seem that morality is part of the material universe, okay? So here's maybe extending the argument a little bit. If we look around in our reality and we recognize that we've discovered morality, it's pretty clear that morality isn't a physical thing, right? We can't do scientific experiments on morality. So it doesn't seem to be part of the physical material universe. It seems to point to something that exists beyond the physical material universe because it itself is immaterial. So similar to mathematical truths, they are immaterial truths, and so it points to something beyond the physical material universe as its source. That is how people utilize this argument to continue making a case for these particular attributes of the supreme being that we've been discussing. Okay? So from the first cause argument, from the design argument, we came up with these reasonable attributes of what this supreme being is like, and we can just add on to those from the moral argument now. Since morality is immaterial, it seems to be that this first cause, which exists outside the physical universe, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, if it's also the source of morality, then we can add that to the list of its attributes. It also makes reasonable sense to say that, look, if this supreme being is the source of morality, it would make sense that it is morally perfect. It seems hard to think of how morality could come from a source that's not morally perfect. So you can make a case for that, and many philosophers have, even going back to Aristotle. And then the third attribute we could add to this is that it seems reasonable that this source of morality then would be personal, because morality specifically has to do with persons, right? As we've talked about farm animals, cows, they don't have moral rights like we do, like persons. Morality seems specifically to be personal. There's a lot of impersonal things around us, right? This podium, chairs, this clicker, right? But they don't seem to participate in the moral realm like we do, right? I could destroy this and burn it and get rid of this clicker, and there wouldn't be I wouldn't be violating any moral truth, right? I wouldn't be violating any moral right or wrong. But if I did that to a person, right, that would be a whole different story. So morality seems to have to do with persons, and therefore, again, it seems reasonable to conclude that this source of morality itself is personal. As I've been saying the last few weeks, thinkers from around the world throughout history have come to this similar conclusion, that there is a supreme being with these sort of characteristics. And the reason why so many thinkers throughout history and around the world came to this conclusion is they followed the same thought process that we've been following over the last month. They've independently, without being necessarily influenced by each other, independently had these thoughts about reality as they viewed reality and brought logical conclusions to what they were observing. They came to this idea that there must be a supreme being with these sort of characteristics. And so you find this idea, theism, really all throughout history around the world. Even within, we could say, polytheistic belief systems, there's always a supreme being from which all the other minor gods came from. So thinkers, philosophers, different sort of belief systems, the vast majority have come to this conclusion that there's a supreme being, and a lot of them through the arguments we've been discussing the last few weeks. I'm sending around a book, actually my book, that was published last year in March. And if you're interested, you could take a look at it, see some of the endorsements on the back. Brian Clark, one of the pastors here in Lincoln, pastor at Berean, he wrote a nice endorsement for the back cover. William Lane Craig, whose ministry puts together these videos, he wrote a nice endorsement on the back. But really the endorsement that means the most to me is a large portion of my book is I'm critiquing one of the leading atheists out there who has made a case for objective morality, but tries to argue that it can exist, there can be objective moral truth even though there is no God. A large portion of my book is I'm critiquing his theory, and we've become friends through this process. And he actually wrote an endorsement for my book, even though it's mostly a critique of his theory. So that means a lot to me, because it shows, what I've tried to do in my ministry is not just beat people over the head with arguments or the Bible, but to befriend them and to have a relational ministry to them as well. So he and I, his name's Erik, he and I go out to eat. We speak at conferences together. We wrote another book together, and I would consider him a friend. But it's somebody that I disagree with, just like your coworkers, neighbors, that we're trying to point towards the truth. Okay, for the rest of the time this morning, I want to tell you about my work in this area, because there's been some really neat, interesting developments in this area of the moral argument. Now, for centuries, most Western thinkers thought that God was the best explanation for objective morality. And that's not surprising, right? But not only within the Abrahamic religions, not only within Christianity, Islam, Judaism, there even are theists outside of the Abrahamic religions who have made the case that morality has a transcendent source. One of the most famous examples throughout history is Plato. So Plato has a really interesting argument that goes like this. He said, look, the physical world is always in flux, right? The physical world is always changing, including us, right? Our bodies seem to change on a daily basis. So this physical world is always changing. It's always in flux. So it can't provide the fixed certainty that's required for objective truth, including moral truth. And so Plato proposed the existence of a transcendent realm made up of universal truths, which he called forms. So you might have heard this before as Plato, the theory of Plato's forms. And he suggested that there was a divine craftsman who used these truths then in making the physical world. So a lot of theists have had similar thoughts in regards to fixed moral truth, that it has to come from some sort of transcendent source. Interestingly enough, many atheists actually agree with this. Many atheists agree that only God could provide a foundation for objective morality. And so when they conclude that there is no God, that leads them to think that morality, therefore, is not objective. One of the most classic examples of this throughout history is Friedrich Nietzsche. He's that atheist philosopher from the 1800s who announced that God is dead. You might have heard of Nietzsche before. Now, we would disagree with Nietzsche on all sorts of levels, right? Because he was an atheist. However, he can be an unlikely ally in this regard because he makes the case that only God could provide a foundation for objective moral truth. And so he powerfully argued against people his fellow atheists, who were trying to find a new foundation for objective moral truth after they rejected God. He critiqued them and said that that's not possible. So you actually, in this argument, the second premise of this argument, you can use some of Nietzsche's arguments to make your point, that only God could function as a foundation for objective moral truth. Unsurprisingly, other atheists have said, no, wait a minute, not so fast. Even if there is no God, that doesn't mean there can't be objective moral truths. So other atheists have disagreed with Nietzsche and said, look, there can be objective moral truth even though there is no God. We don't need God as a foundation for moral truth. Maybe moral truth can exist on its own. So in that sense, this particular group of atheists have made the case that morality is self-existent. Not only is it self-evident, but it's also self-existent. It doesn't need a foundation. Now, one of the key instigators of this movement was G.E. Moore in the early 1900s. G.E. Moore was one of the founders of analytic philosophy, and in his book in 1903, he really made some waves when it comes to this area of moral theory. And even though his ideas are over 100 years old now, within the last 20, 30 years, they've really picked up steam. So there's been this huge shift of atheists, so academic, professional philosophers who are atheists. A lot of them, in fact, most of them now, have moved from believing that morality was subjective and relative to now they affirm that there is objective moral truth. They just believe that it can be there, it can exist, even though there is no God. And so the conversation has really switched from just, arguing against subjective morality. It's moved away from that because these, at least at the professional academic level, these atheists believe in objective morality. So now the conversation has really shifted for us to premise 2, making the case that God's the best explanation for those objective moral truths. Let me just focus in on one key figure, probably the key figure in this movement, and that's who I wrote a lot against in my book. His name is Erik Wielenberg. And look at the last quote there on the screen. This is a quote from him, just so you can understand his theory. So Wielenberg argues, whereas proponents of theistic approaches to moral realism seek to make God the foundation of objective moral truth, I argue that it is at least as plausible to construe objective moral truth as not needing an external foundation at all. And so other atheists, Wielenberg and others, are part of this group called Morean. They're part of this Morean camp, going back to G.E. Moore. developing fairly sophisticated philosophical theories of how there can be objective moral truth that doesn't need a foundation, that doesn't need God. So let me give you another quote from Wielenberg so you can understand better his theory. This is what he wrote. He said, "These moral facts, such moral facts, are the foundation of the rest of objective morality, and they rest on no foundation themselves. To ask of such facts, where do they come from, or on what foundation do they rest, is misguided. In much the same way, according to many theists, it's misguided to ask, where does God come from, or on what foundation does God rest? The answer is the same in both cases. They come from nowhere, and nothing external to themselves grounds their existence. Rather, they're fundamental features of the universe that ground other truths." So this might be bringing back some thoughts. You might be remembering some of the things we said in the first cause argument when we had that conversation, because it follows a similar pattern, right? Remember the first cause argument that something caused me, and then my parents, something caused them, and there seems to be this series of causes that go backwards in time, but can that series of causes go back forever? And the first cause argument says, no, it can't. You can't have an actual infinite set of anything, including causes. So there has to be a first cause, right? And people used to think that maybe the universe was the first cause. The universe was the thing that wasn't caused, that was self-existent. But now that we know that the universe has a beginning, people have rejected that idea, and now we recognize that the universe must have had a cause. The universe itself can't be the first cause. Well, similarly, even though this takes a little bit more conceptual thought, the same thing happens in morality, right? The same thing happens in morality. There has to be some stopping point. You can't say, well, why is that good? Okay, well, that's good or that's wrong because it harms somebody. Well, why is it good not to harm somebody? What makes that good? It's the same sort of thought process going back and going back. There's got to be some ultimate good that becomes the first good, so to speak. So it's kind of like a first cause argument, but it's a first good argument. And as you can see, I think Wielenberg does a good job here laying out the difference between our position and his, where he's saying that there's just these brute moral truths that exist. They're uncaused, they just exist on their own, they don't have a foundation, so in a sense that's like his first cause in the moral realm. Whereas we're saying, no, God is the first cause morally. God is the first good. He's the ultimate foundation of which there's nothing prior, morally speaking. So you can kind of parallel with the first cause argument, and I think that helps people understand a bit better what's going on. So just to summarize, 3 positions here. The first position would be our position, basically, that there are objective moral truths and that God's the best explanation for them. The second position, this would be atheists like Nietzsche and others who believe in subjective morality. They would say moral truths are not real. They're just ideas that we have, maybe through evolution. And that was the most common position among atheists. But now things have shifted to where most professional academic philosophers who are atheists hold position 3 now. That there are objective moral truths, and I'm thankful that they believe there are, because I think that's correct. But they don't think they come from God. They think that they can exist on their own because there is no God. Well, why is this important for Christians? Well, I think it's good for us to be aware of this conversation. And again, these conversations are taking place at the highest academic level. And it's neat for us to be able to participate in them and be able to have a voice. And the Christian voice in this conversation has been very strong and loud in a good sense. And we've been focusing our attention, and I certainly have, on this second premise now. Not arguing as much for yesterday's enemy, subjective morality, but arguing now against all these new atheistic ideas where they're claiming objective moral truth can be there even though there is no God. So it's a neat opportunity for us to join this conversation and make a case for God in these realms. All right. I want to talk a little bit about my particular moral theory, because I get a little bit more specific, and as you can, maybe if you've thumbed through my book already, you can see. If you are interested, you can purchase that everywhere books are sold, Walmart.com, Amazon, so on and so forth, Christian bookstore. It's around $15. But in my book, I get a little bit more specific than just making the case that God is the best explanation for morality. Because even though all Christians, all theists agree that God's the best explanation for morality, there's disagreements, even among Christians, as to how that works. How is it that God is the source of morality? Is it through His commands? Is it through ideas, His will, His sovereign will? Is it the way He made human nature? Is that how God is the source of morality? So I want you to talk I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but I want to give you a couple minutes just to get your brain working again, listening to me for so long, jumpstart your thinking, and discuss with somebody sitting next to you just for a couple minutes. How do you think God is the source? We all agree God's the source of morality, but how? How is He the source and foundation? So discuss for just a couple minutes here. So kind of how this worked out for me was interacting with Erik Wielenberg often. He'd read the stuff that I was writing, publishing in academic journals and stuff against his theory. He would read them, give me feedback, we'd discuss, and he'd push back on my ideas, which was really helpful. But it was through that process over the last 10 to 12 years, as I was working on my PhD, this became the culmination of my PhD dissertation, which then is the book. That's ultimately what the book comes from, is my PhD dissertation. But through the process of interacting with my opponent in this regard, it caused me to carefully think more about how God is the source and foundation. Before all of this, I just thought, that was a simple, obvious explanation, right? Well, God is the source. But what he helped me do, my opponent, helped me think through how. How exactly is God the source? And so through that process, I developed what I call my divine love theory. And if you saw my book already, you've probably noticed just even the subtitle says it, that I think that the Trinity ultimately is the source and foundation of morality. And so I try to build out that idea theologically, using Scripture to form my theory, developed a theory where the loving relationships between the members of the Trinity is the ultimate source and foundation of morality. So in a sense, that's kind of the fixed standard of morality, right? The loving relationship between the members of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit, become that fixed measuring stick, if you will, through which we can measure to see if something is morally good or bad. So let me jump ahead to an example really quick, kind of make this simple. So sometimes people will push back on my theory, even Christians, and say, well, that doesn't really make sense because the divine persons, Father, Son, and Spirit, are just so different than us, right? I mean, how could anything we do resemble them? I mean, you talk about how murder is wrong, but the divine persons, right? God can't die, so how could our moral actions resemble the Trinity at all? Well, here's what I mean by that. Because of the way that God made us, because of the way that God created human nature and how our bodies work, murdering somebody is an unloving thing to do, right? I think we would all agree to that. So murdering somebody, because of the way God created our bodies, is an unloving thing to do. It's that unloving aspect of it that doesn't resemble the Trinity and therefore makes it morally bad, makes it evil. Protecting somebody from a murderer, protecting an innocent child from a murderer, would be a loving thing to do. So it's not the murdering or the protecting from a murderer that is like the Trinity or unlike the Trinity. It's whether the action is loving or unloving. And that certainly can resemble the Trinity. So a lot of this is determined by how God made our human nature. So silly thought experiment, if God would have made human bodies such that if I murdered someone, it tickled and they came back to life 30 seconds later, God could have made our human nature like that, right? Then murdering somebody wouldn't be an unloving thing to do, right? So it's not a lot of it's determined by our human nature, what determines whether something is loving or unloving, and then whether it's loving or unloving determines whether it resembles the love between the Trinity or not. So that is a very simple example that kind of at least gets your mind around what I'm saying. That's why the incarnation is so powerful, so incredible. Let me just end with this. But before I discuss that slide, that's why the incarnation, Jesus taking on flesh, is so helpful for us, because what he does is he shows us exactly what it means to be loving given the human nature that we have. He shows us, taking on human nature, how to be loving given the human nature that we have. And so the incarnation is such a great thing because we get to see what being loving looks like within our human realm, so to speak. So the way the book lays out is I make my case for this divine love theory, that the loving relationships between the Trinity are the source and foundation of morality. And I go into a lot of scripture and make my case theologically for that, look at other Christian theories of morality, and make the case that my theory is a better interpretation of scripture. And then I compare and contrast my theory with this leading atheistic theory of morality, Erik Wielenberg's theory. So it's kind of a compare contrast in that regard. And then as you can see, I make a case that my theory has all of these things that seem to be needed for objective morality to exist, or at least if they have it, they're a better explanation for objective morality than if a theory doesn't have these things. And then I point out that Wielenberg's doesn't. So if you'd like to delve into this issue a bit more, of course there's my book. But there's a lot of resources on our website too, the Convincing Proof website, the Convincing Proof YouTube channel. Since this is what I specialize in, it's going to be easy to find a bunch of material on this. There's some debates I have coming up you might be interested in. So actually pray for me about these. Both of them take place in April. There's two different atheist philosophers who reached out to me. One of them is a professor at Notre Dame, and he reached out to me to debate this issue. So he's an atheist but believes that there's objective moral truth. And we're going to have this debate in April at UNL. So we'll be advertising that. You can on my website you can sign up for the monthly newsletter for Convincing Proof, and you can make sure to get all these updates of where I'm speaking and what I'm doing, how you can pray for the ministry. But that's going to be here in Lincoln at UNL in April. We'll have that public debate. And then the other atheist invited me to debate at the University of Texas at Austin in April. But it's the same issue. Again, a different atheist. He has a different theory, atheistic theory of how morality can be objectively true even if there is no God. So people enjoy debates. Sometimes I think people are anticipating the debate is going to be like a political debate and it's going to be all sparks and jokes and insults. But you might be surprised, at least when I debate somebody, I try to do it as respectfully and lovingly and kindly as possible, because I think that goes further in reaching the person, because we don't want to destroy them. We're not trying to beat them over the head with the truth. We're trying to lovingly point them to the truth. And so I don't straw man their arguments. If anything, I try to steel man their arguments, take their best arguments and walk them through. It might not be as entertaining, but but I try to take their strongest arguments and walk through and show how they're incorrect. So there's some debates I've already done, a debate with Erik Wielenberg, a debate with Dan Barker at an atheist conference a couple years ago. They're already out there on YouTube, and we'll put these new debates on YouTube eventually as well. So thanks so much for coming this morning, guys.